Hello, everyone. I am here with Professor Gad Saad from the a professor at Concordia University, Montreal, who holds the chair of the John Molson School of Business. So I got that correct. You've got it muted.
Sorry, I hold the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption.
There we go. And I will just present your screen to everyone so they can see who you are. Right.
Okay.
How are you?
Very good. Great to be here with you finally after a few technical hiccups.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. It's been a pain. So where to begin? Would you like to tell everyone what your expertise is and what you do?
Right. My first semester as a doctoral student, now this is going back 25 years ago, I was taking an advanced social psychology course. And in that course, the professor halfway through the semester assigned a book called Homicide, which was a book written by two evolutionary psychologists in Canada where they looked at patterns of criminality from an evolutionary perspective. In other words, they demonstrated that there were certain patterns of criminality that were very, very similar, irrespective of cultural setting, irrespective of time period. And what allowed them to explain all of these patterns was evolutionary psychology. So that was the original place where I was first exposed to the principles of evolutionary psychology. Now, since I was interested in studying consumer psychology, I thought, well, what I'd like to do is really Darwinize the study of consumption by bringing in these ideas from evolutionary biology. And so I founded the discipline of evolutionary consumption. And for the first perhaps 10 years or so of my career, I was pretty much the only lone wolf who was beating the drums of Darwinism and consumer behavior. Now there's a few new people who've come into the field. So at bottom line, I apply evolutionary psychology to study consumer behavior.
So just to be clear, that your main opposition to the evolutionary perspective on consumer behavior is the social constructivists. Is that correct?
Exactly. So there is something. So the acronym is SSSM, which is the Standard Social Science Model. This is a term that was introduced by Tooby and Cosmides, two of the founders of evolutionary psychology. Mm-hmm. And basically, the idea of these social constructivists is that what makes us different from animals is that we transcend our biology. So while biology and evolutionary principles might apply to explain the behaviors of the zebra and the giraffe and the mosquito and the salamander, that's great. But when it comes to the study of human behavior, especially things related to the brain, many of these folks don't mind if you apply evolutionary principles to explain why your pancreas have evolved to be the way they are. But once you apply it to anything above the neck, well, then clearly this suggests that you are a Nazi. You're a woman hater, right? You're involved in some conspiracy to bring back eugenics. And so, the sources of, of detractors really come in all sorts of different robes. But certainly the social scientists have been slow in accepting the idea that humans are biological beings.
Well, I mean, wouldn't accepting your perspective on this completely undermine everything about their own?
Exactly, and I think that's really the source of the hostility. It's almost impenetrable. The good news, though, is that to the extent that one would like to think that social scientists still adhere to the scientific method, then when I put on my optimistic hat, I say that, look, science is an autocorrective process. Yes. One has to be patient, and eventually, by constantly chipping away at their paradigmatic defenses, eventually the cumulative evidence becomes so great that they can no longer deny it. And to be fair, if I were to compare when I first started to Darwinize the field, say, 17, 18 years ago, to today, the hostility then was greater than now. So in other words, today they're still quite hostile, but they're certainly less self-assured in their hostility.
Can you give us a quick example of how evolutionary consumerism works?
Sure.
I don't know anything about it, obviously. So for me, when I hear it, I think probably something along the lines of when you go shopping when you're hungry, you end up coming back with huge amounts of extra food that you wouldn't normally buy.
Right, so that would be a great example. That would be
Yeah.
an example
Okay.
of how the mechanism of food hoarding, right? So to the extent that one of the greatest survival challenges faced by any organism is, how to get tonight's dinner and how to avoid becoming somebody else's dinner, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
predator avoidance and food hoarding are two of the key mechanisms of natural selection, or that natural selection seeks to, if you like, find adaptations for,
Hmm.
well, then it would make sense that since we've evolved in environments of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty, that we've evolved this desire to gorge. So when my blood sugar is down and I'm hungry, it's probably not the good time to go grocery shopping because I'm going to overbuy, and
Yeah.
those findings have been actually found. But let me give you a few others. I mean, of course, we
Great.
could
Yeah.
spend
Yeah. Please.
the,
Yeah.
the whole show on only that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so I did a study a few years ago, and again, we could cover as many as you'd like. So
We've
I
got
did
plenty of time. Honestly, I'm happy to
exactly
explore it.
beautiful. So let's see if we can beat my time on Joe Rogan, which was almost 3 hours.
Jeez. Well, I have been known to ramble for quite some time. So yeah,
Okay,
go ahead. Go ahead.
okay. So a few years ago, I did a study with one of my former graduate students, and the genesis of the idea came to me when I was looking at the types of sexual signaling that various species engage in. So the classic example is the peacock, right?
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
peacock, but of course there are a million other examples,
Of
but
course.
that's
Yeah.
that's the one that people are familiar with. So let's take that one. So the peacock basically shows off its tail, which has iridescent colors, which is big, which has symmetrical patterns, and all of these are basically advertising, right? To use a
Hmm.
consumer term, they're advertising good phenotypic quality. You must choose me because look, despite the fact that this is making me more visible to predators, I'm still here, so you should mate with me. Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I thought, well, how can I take this principle, which in biology is known as the handicap principle, right? Because you're handicapping yourself
Hmm.
in lieu of predators that are around. And how can I apply it to consumer behavior? Well, there are all sorts of very ostentatious purchases, very various forms of conspicuous consumption that are nothing but, to use the colloquial language, peacocking, right?
Yeah.
And so the fancy sports car is akin to the peacock's tail. Okay, so far so good, but how could we go about testing some of these ideas scientifically? So I thought, well, we know that when, say, two males of many species fight one another, the one who wins the fight has an increase in his testosterone level. The one who loses has a decrease in his. So we set up an experiment. This is with my former graduate student, where
Hmm.
we rented a Porsche, and we had an old beaten up sedan, so high status car, low status car,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we brought in men and we had them drive both cars downtown Montreal and also on a semi-deserted highway. One is visible, one is not so visible. And then after each driving condition, we measured their testosterone levels or fluctuations in testosterone level via salivary assays. And of
Mhm.
course, as you might predict, even if you know nothing about evolutionary
I can see
biology,
where this is going. Yeah.
exactly,
The Porsche was.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And it makes the endocrinological system explode. Now, one reviewer had noted when he was reviewing, he or she, I don't know the sex of the person,
Hmm.
when they were reviewing the paper, said, well, how do you know that this testosterone reaction is not simply due to the fact that they were driving fast and so on? Well, other than the fact that we had given them very strict instructions, which hopefully they adhere to, when they're in downtown Montreal, when they're driving on a weekend in downtown Montreal, it's basically like driving in a parking lot. It's bumper to
Ah.
bumper. So that's a natural way to control for that possible alternate explanation. It's
Yeah.
certainly not because they're driving fast. It's because they are sending a cue that says, look at me, I'm in a Porsche, and that's going to make my testosterone rise. So that would be an example of linking testosterone to sexual signaling in a consumer setting. Now let's take the other sex. So it's not only in the human species, it's not only men who engage in sexual signaling.
Of
Of course,
course.
women do it as well, but of course they use different products to attract men, right? I mean, this is why even though there are many women who are millionaires and billionaires, 99% of Ferrari owners are male. And it's not because women can't afford them, right?
Yeah.
Because men don't care, right? I mean, yeah, I'm not going to say if a gorgeous woman passes by and says, hey, let's have sex, I'm going to say, oh my goodness, you're driving a Toyota Corolla? No way. No sex for you, Linda. It's not happening. Go get me an Aston Martin and it's on, right?
Yeah.
And so women will use different sexual signals. Now, of course, they will use beautification. And so with another of my graduate students, uh, what we did basically is we kept track of women's behaviors across a full cycle of their ovulatory cycle. So we basically kept track of everyday behaviors of women for 35 days. 35 days because usually the typical menstrual cycle lasts for 28 days. And so what we wanted to see, among other things, was whether women would engage in the greatest amount of beautification, specifically during the maximally fertile phase of their cycle. Right?
It's completely logical that they would, isn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, why would they not? You know.
Exactly right. Now, and by the way, the reason why I often start off with these examples when somebody asks me about evolutionary consumption, and the reason why I specifically chose these areas to study is because it's a very strategic decision. It makes it that much more difficult when you are using physiological based measures for the social constructivists to say, oh, no, but it's due to socialization, it's due to culture, it's due to learning, it's due to my rabbi, right?
How could it possibly be about socialization? I don't know when a woman's ovulatory cycle is going on. You know, I have no idea. You know, sorry, Karen.
Yeah, so those would be two examples. Maybe I could give you another one, and then you could tell me if you want. So I have an ongoing project now that's not yet published. So to kind of move away from sex issues, because of course evolutionary principles don't only apply to mating. And so I have a study with some Israeli colleagues where we looked at gift giving at Israeli weddings. Specifically, we looked at the size of the monetary gifts. So, for example, Uncle Mordechai gives $200 to the bride, and we actually had data from 30 Israeli weddings where each of the people who gave monetary gifts were listed, right, in a list.
Right. Yeah.
And so we wanted to test two things. Number one, we wanted to test whether the genetic relatedness between the offerer and the bride and groom would affect the size of the monetary gift. So put simply, if I'm your brother, I'm likely to give you a bigger gift than if I'm your second cousin, if only because I share more genes with you on average. So that one, I think, is intuitive, and people could have probably predicted that even if they knew nothing about genetics or evolutionary psychology.
I think there could also be other reasons for that, though, couldn't there? I mean, just familiarity could be.
Exactly. Familiarity, the fact that you grew up together, absolutely.
Yeah.
The second one makes it a bit more difficult to argue for anything other than evolutionary theory. And so if you look at, for example, your 4 grandparents, on average, you share 25% of your genes with each. So if you were only looking at genetic relatedness as the operative factor, they're all equally genetically related to you. But if you now add a second component, known as genetic assuredness. How assured are you of the genetic link? Well, your maternal grandmother, since it's down the maternal line, there is no such thing as maternal uncertainty, and therefore her genetic link to you is absolutely assured. Your paternal grandfather has 2 generations of paternity uncertainty, and therefore, as has been found in the research, this is known as differential grandparental solicitude, which basically says that your 4 grandparents don't invest equally in you. Your maternal grandmother invests the most, your paternal grandfather invests the least, and the other 2 grandparents somewhere in the middle. So we took this idea and said, well, using this very, very subtle Darwinian explanation, we predict that the maternal side of the bride and groom would give larger gifts than the paternal side of the bride and groom, and that's exactly what we found. Now, the reason why that's a really powerful demonstration, if I may say so, about my own work, is that it's very, very difficult for anybody to argue, number one, oh, it's just due to random socialization, but also it's almost impossible for someone to have posited such a hypothesis were it not that you were coming with the evolutionary lens to generate your hypothesis. This hypothesis would have remained invisible to you if you didn't know these ideas about paternity uncertainty and so on. So that's one of the beautiful things about evolutionary psychology, is that it allows you to propose research questions that would have otherwise remained completely invisible to you. Now, I could maybe add a few things that kind of speak to the importance of evolutionary psychology. Is this something that we want to explore?
Absolutely.
Okay. So one of the things that people don't understand about, evolutionary theory in general is this idea of proximate versus ultimate explanations. So a proximate explanation in science refers to answering the how and the what. How does the mechanism operate? So if you have diabetes, how does your blood sugar result in diabetes? That's a mechanistic explanation. So it's answering the how and what. The ultimate explanation doesn't mean ultimate in that it's superior. It's not in that sense. Ultimate means the Darwinian why. Why would the mechanism have evolved to be of that form?
Right.
So now let me give you I love to give this example because it so clearly demonstrates the difference between the two levels of explanations. So if you take, for example, pregnancy sickness, the idea that women become, many people call it morning sickness, but it's really, the more general term is pregnancy sickness because some women don't get it in the morning, right? So they're nauseous, they throw up, they're repulsed by certain foods. It's a really miserable time. Now, if you were to study the proximate causes of pregnancy sickness, there are all sorts of things you could study. You could study how the changes in a woman's hormonal profile exacerbates the severity of the symptoms. Right? That's a perfectly fine question to ask. Nothing wrong with that. The ultimate question is the following. To the extent that this physiological mechanism is one that is found universally across cultures, across time periods, right? It's not specific to women in England or Lebanon. Why would women have evolved this physiological reaction? What is the adaptive solution to which pregnancy sickness is targeted at? And here, the one who first proposed this is a scholar by the name of Profet, P-R-O-F-E-T. She basically argued and came up with unbelievable evidence in support of her theory that basically what happens is that pregnancy sickness happens during organogenesis. This is during the first trimester of pregnancy, where if a woman is exposed to food pathogens, that would wreak havoc to the developing embryo, right? And that's why it's called organogenesis, right? The organs are forming. And so therefore, during that time period, it is profoundly important that the woman not be exposed to teratogens and food pathogens. Therefore, the pregnancy sickness is an adaptive solution to that very real problem. And how does that solution get instantiated? Well, women are repulsed by certain foods that are likely to have high pathogenic load. They are attracted to foods that solve exposure to pathogens, like pickles. That's why pregnant women often will desire pickles out of the blue. It starts at organogenesis, it ends at the end of organogenesis. So if basically you look at all of the possible epidemiological facts, you quickly realize that it is indeed an adaptive mechanism. Now, if you're a woman and you go see your gynecologist and you say, hey, doc, help me with my pregnancy sickness, he or she will give you a pill to soften the severity of the symptoms, which is the perfectly wrong evolutionary thing to do, because those pregnancy sickness symptoms are actually beneficial to the child.
Yeah, they're there to protect it from any kind of deformity or malformation from eating a pathogenic food.
Exactly right. And so therefore you see here how the social constructivists who are actually threatened by my work, in a sense, I come to them with some good news. As long as the work that they're doing is not completely removed from reality, it is possible for them to propose a explanation at the proximate level, and I come along and offer the ultimate explanation for that phenomenon, and both of us are correct in that they are simply operating at a different level of analysis. So together we can explain the phenomenon better than if it were only explained at the proximate level. I mean, the good news from my perspective is that at least I'm doing something that gets people riled up, whether it be right, and so it's certainly not inconsequential. It's a big battle every day. But as I said, I truly believe that with patience, science is an autocorrective process, and eventually they will shudder away in shame. So I'll give you a good example of what you're talking about. So if I get up in front of a crowd, which might include some hostile detractors, and I propose some evolutionary explanation for some sex difference that is congruent with the ideology of, say, radical feminists, and I'll give you specific examples in a second, then they'll all come up, oh, Dr. Saad, brilliant, love it, fantastic, beautiful work. If I, of course, on the other hand, come up with an evolutionary explanation for something that is incongruent with their ideology, boo, Nazi, Himmler, right?
I love the idea of calling a Jew a Nazi.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm one of those Jews that's really self-hating, that's in support of Nazism. Yes.
Oh, yeah, internalized anti-Semitism.
That's right. The flagellation of the progressive, right? So anyway, so let me give you the concrete example. So, for example, if I say, well, there's extraordinary amount of evidence that suggests that on average there would have been evolutionary reasons why men would evolve to be greater seeking in terms of sexual variety. So it's not that women are these chaste, prude, Victorian, angels, but on average, if you look around the world and across time, and that data does exist and it has been documented very extensively, well, it is clear that men are simply more, have a greater penchant for sexual variety. That doesn't sound good. I must be a sexist pig. On the other hand, now let's continue the discussion. If I say, well, but there is actually quite a bit of evidence that suggests that women are actually quite the duplicitous, sexual beasts. And let me give you some examples. So, for example, if you look at the likelihood of a woman cheating on her long-term partner, it's most likely to happen when she is maximally fertile. And she's most likely to not insist on using protection, right? This is called the sperm extraction hypothesis. It's basically saying that she's shopping for good genes, right? So when she cheats on her long-term partner, she's basically saying, maybe I could go behind the bushes and find some superior genetic specimen, and hopefully the poor chump at home could raise it as his own, right? That's it's called the cuckoldry. Go ahead.
She's obviously with him because he has other attributes about him, like he might have a very high-paying job, or very secure job, or something like that.
Exactly right.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry.
Now let's go on. So if I then give data from across primate species, so if you look at the size of the testes of different primates as a function of their body weight. So, for example, if you look at chimps, male chimps, they're basically walking testicles, right? Right, like their whole body, their whole being, their whole morphology is to support these gigantic testicles. And the reason why they've evolved such big testes is because the females of that species are astronomically promiscuous. So, in other words, the size of testicles.
I can't imagine why feminists hate you. Sorry, it's so...
No, but hold on, they're going to be happy at the end of this discussion.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. Yeah. So carry on, please.
So the size of the chimp's testicles are a adaptation to female behavior in that species. So, for example, male gorillas who have a polygynous mating system, meaning there's one dominant male that controls sexual access to many females, so meaning that there isn't a lot of sperm competition. Well, the male gorillas, despite the fact that if you see them, they're incredibly impressive how they look, they actually have very small testicles.
Yeah.
Now, humans actually place closer, if you'd like, on the chimp end of that curve. In other words, if we go by that function, this suggests that because of the size of our testicles, women have been going around behind our back for quite a bit. Now, let me give you one other data point. There's a guy by name, so there's a guy by name of, I think his name is Robin Baker. I can't remember his name. I hope I've gotten his name right. He wrote a book called, I think, Sperm Wars in the mid-90s. And he talks about the fact that the morphology of spermatozoa, when you think of spermatozoa, you sort of think of the classical sperm with the head and the tail that is sort of swimming to find the egg. But he actually documented that there are two other forms of, if you like, phenotypes of of sperm. There's what are called the blockers. Now, those are spermatozoa that have no interest in seeking the egg. They simply go into the female reproductive tract, and they try to block the possibility of other men's sperm coming in. And then there are other sperms that are called killer sperms that sort of go around looking for other men's sperm to kill. Now, this theory has been debated, but let's go on for a second.
Yeah.
Now, sperm is viable in a woman's reproductive tract for roughly 72 hours, which means, now, I think hopefully you know where I'm going with this. If men have evolved,
trying not to think, sorry.
If men have, yeah, do you know where your wife is today?
So, I do.
So if you think that sperm is viable in a woman's reproductive tract for 72 hours, and if men have evolved this sort of huge panoply of chemical weaponry to fight against the other men's sperm, this means that it was very likely, evolutionarily speaking, that a woman could have coupled with multiple males within a 72-hour period. And hence, when you take all of this data that I just spent quite a bit of time judiciously, presenting to you, this suggests that women are hardly the chaste, prude Victorian angels. Now, when I present that data,
they love that, I bet.
Oh my God, long live Dr. Saad, long live Dr. Saad. So then it's all good. Men are sexually promiscuous, women are sexually promiscuous.
Monogamy is silly.
So that's the problem, is that it's always, evolutionary theory is so dangerous to the pet ideology of so many different types of people that they end up all lining up to hate on you for all sorts of different reasons. But the bottom line is, if you're right, and more generally, starting with Darwin, if he's right, then my pet ideology is in trouble. So I got to shoot down this Jew boy. Biological determinism is actually a complete canard. It's complete nonsense. So in other words, if anybody comes to you and says, oh, evolutionary theory is biologically deterministic, then they've just basically advertised, I'm an idiot. I don't understand a thing about biology. I don't mean you. Sorry. No. So the correct position is what's called an interactionist position. Pretty much everything that we are is a intricate melange of our biology and environmental inputs. Even genes themselves. So, I mean, you could argue that nothing is more reductionist than looking at something at the gene level. Genes get turned on or off as a function of environmental inputs. Natural selection and sexual selection operate within specific environments. So it is wrong to argue that evolutionary theory is deterministic. It's a nonsensical term. Everything is an interaction with our genes and our environments and our idiosyncratic abilities. So let me give you an example. The evolutionary principle that men should be very desirous to seek high social status, because that's something that women desire around the world and throughout times, that is a evolutionary adaptive argument. Now, the way that individual men go about instantiating the pursuit of high social status is completely idiosyncratic. Sargon might become a YouTube star and make tons of money and become famous that way. Somebody else might become a great neurosurgeon. Another guy might become a great soccer player. So there is nothing deterministic in simply recognizing that there are biological blueprints that we come to existence with. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that it's deterministic. So, for example, if I say, look, on average, it is very difficult for men and women to stay true to their monogamous unions because, frankly, we've evolved, and it's, the evidence is incontestable for both men and women. We've evolved the desire and the preference to actually engage in multiple matings. And so now that doesn't mean, though, that you are doomed to cheat on your monogamous union. And the way that I usually try to get them over that hump is to say, look, at any given time, any organism is, if you'd like, being pulled by different Darwinian levers in different directions. So I may have the evolved desire to potentially stray on my monogamous union, but I also have a moral compass, right? So my moral sense is also due to an evolutionary process, and that moral compass can actually pull me back. So offering an evolutionary explanation in no way argues that it's deterministic, it's fatalistic. It only recognizes that humans are both a biological and cultural animal. I'll give you a great metaphor. It's not, I remember who the original person who came up with it, but I call it the cake metaphor. So when you're talking about this idea of nature versus nurture, the way to answer that, that's really a false dichotomy. And the way that one can answer that to explain it to people is via what I call the cake metaphor. So if you take the ingredients of a cake, you take the flour, the sugar, the eggs, right? Each of those ingredients before you bake the cake are separate and distinguishable from one another, right? Yeah. Now I bake the cake using all those ingredients. So now the final cake comes out. Could I point to you and say, point to where the sugar is, point towards where you can't. It's an inextricable mix. So human beings, it is undoubtedly true that we are an inextricable mix of our nature and nurture. The problem with, I think, most of the social sciences has been that they've really built these edifices, theoretical and empirical edifices for the past 100 years, where they pretty much completely rejected the biological end. And that is a form of religion, right? I'll give you an example of exactly what you're saying. Yeah, so there's a movement called cultural relativism.
Yep.
Which of course I think you're familiar with. Now you might know it.
Should we just explain? Would you like to explain it? Just
please. Okay, no problem. So cultural relativism, in the context of the social justice warrior types, refers to the fact that all cultures are relative in how they've evolved. Who are we to judge the fact that in some culture they might gouge the eyes of children?
They might stone women to death.
Right. I mean, who are we to decide, what's up is down, what's left, what's right? Okay. So that, if you like, political-based cultural relativism actually stems, the genesis of that movement actually comes from social sciences. It stems from some anthropologists who were, so starting with Franz Boas, who was a anthropologist at Columbia Universities. This is going back close to 100 years ago now, where he basically argued that, well, cultural relativists, there are no human universals. There is no such thing as a human nature, right? What makes humans humans is that they're completely cultural beings. So any single human universal that you, Sargon, might propose, no way. I could find some distant tribe in some Venezuelan forest where that universal does not hold. And therefore, everything is culturally relative. There are no such things. So even if it comes to mating, the sex differences that the average 3-year-old understands, no, this is due to the patriarchy. It's due to so on, right?
Sorry, I love the patriarchy.
Yeah, the patriarchy, right? Apparently, I'm one of its leaders, and I've never been invited to a damn meeting, so I don't know how that works. So going back to Franz Boas, so he then trained a whole generation of cultural anthropologists. Perhaps the most famous one, maybe you and some of your viewers might know her, is Margaret Mead, who went to Samoa desperately hoping to show that even something as trivially obvious as the fact that men are much more desirous of pursuing sex than women, that's a complete social construction. And she apparently found a society where the women are sexually aggressive and the men are, oh, no, I can't, I don't want to, I'm afraid, I want to be chaste and virginal. Now, of course, this was complete nonsense, part fabrication, part the participants whom she was asking these questions were just taking her for a ride. And so there's a book that came out a few years ago called The Fateful Hoaxing of Margaret Mead, which basically showed that, pretty much everything that a lot of what she wrote was utter BS. But she was so desperate to demonstrate that something as innately true and as human universal as sex differences in mating behavior were not due to biology. And so now you might say, well, why did they come in? Surely these people are not idiots. They're obviously sophisticated people who were educated. How could they fool themselves in such a manner? And I think the answer, at least the one that I propose, is that it actually came from a noble place, noble in quotes. Because what they wanted to do, they quickly realized that there are very dangerous repercussions when evolutionary theory falls in the wrong hands. So British, right? So the British, class elitists came up with, quote, social Darwinism, which of course has nothing to do with Darwinism, where they said, hey, look, it's a struggle between the classes. And so if the lower class loses and they die off in the street and they're uneducated, well, who cares? That's nature. That's Darwinian struggle. The Nazis said, hey, we are the Aryan race. It's a struggle between the races. And so if we kill the gypsies, the homosexuals, and the Jews, hey, that's just Darwinian theory. What's wrong with that? That's nature. Eugenicists said, hey, we don't want to have too many brown immigrants coming from Sicily. And so maybe let's set up a eugenics, or let's get rid of homosexuals so that the, quote, gay gene doesn't spread. And so all of these miscreants, all of these cretins, latched onto biological-based thinking in the pursuit of their own, ideological interests. And so these social scientists came along and said, all right, we're going to create a new worldview where biology ceases to matter, and hopefully this can forestall, if not eradicate, the possibility of anybody misusing it. So I think they came from a noble place, but ultimately they were pure schmucks. And I think the hypocrisy of their position is deafening, because so they'll take on some gamer, whatever the story is, but clitoris removal, no, don't worry about that. That's culturally relative. So who are we to judge?
They've got more important things. There was a transphobic joke in a game,
Exactly. And so that's why we've got the heroine, the queen of offense, Anita Sarkeesian, fighting the good battle for all of us. As somebody who comes from the Middle East, I could tell you that many women in that region face greater problems than stereotypical patriarchal depictions in gaming, right? Yeah, so Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you may remember this. Last year in spring 2014, she was invited to Brandeis University. Now, Brandeis University was set up by Brandeis, a Jewish man, I believe a judge, to remove the anti-Semitism that was prevalent in some of the higher institutes of higher learning in the U.S. So it's a very liberty-based institution. Yet here is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's dedicated her life to the plight of women around the world. Apparently, because she criticizes one religion, I can't remember which religion. I think it's maybe the Amish, maybe it's the Jains. I can't remember which religion it is. I'm being facetious. Apparently, she was a hate-filled hate monger who had to be disinvited from Brandeis because this university, which is founded on ideals of freedom of speech and tolerance and liberty, found her too hateful. So when you're getting to that level of lunacy, we're in trouble. I was going to say, I think it comes, there are a couple of facets to, if you like, the mindset of the so-called progressive. I think first, most people are cognitive misers. They're cognitively lazy, right? And so they wish to take a few key talking points, and if somehow it supports their general identity, I'm somebody who's tolerant, I don't like to criticize people, I'll latch onto that. It's too much hard work for me to try to really understand the details of the issue. Is this particular religion peaceful or not? Well, I could either look at the data, study the original canonical text to see whether it preaches love and brotherhood or not. But, that's a lot of work. I'd rather simply listen to whether President Obama says the religion is peaceful or not. Now, I like President Obama because I'm progressive and I want to support him. Therefore, it's a lot easier for me as a card-carrying member of the progressive platform to simply go along with it. And then you've got this herd mentality where it becomes clear that if you're going to be accepted among the latte drinking folks in the university clubs, you better hold certain views. And therefore, people become scared to speak out against those views.
Well,